Righty. Now let's take a look through the empirical data, or some empirical data, and remember Blanchard saying that even after all the years of research that has gone into how the money supply is created, the guy who edits the Journal of Macroeconomics still believes the central bank adjusts the nominal money stock rather than controlling the interest rate. But anyway, well, if the money supply was exogenous, then changes in the stock of money should either have no effect on the real economy or only alter prices. Okay, and that's the latter way that they tend to think about it. Changing the money supply will change the price level. And also, what happens with narrow government money should precede what happens with broader components of the money supply. So what does the data show? Ironically, again, it's quite strange often this happens, some very good empirical research is done by two absolutely obsessive neoclassicals who gave us the neoclassical growth model, strangely enough. But back in 1990, they simply did a good piece of research looking at the timing of economic variables to try to work out what causes what. Because at a simplistic level, if a variable y follows x in time, then it's pretty hard to say that y causes x. Now you can get complex relationships in nonlinear systems which allow that and shifting time lag, which I'll show you in later papers, but this is the basic starting point they began from. Now, from our point of view, if you're going to say the money supply is exogenous, then it's either got to be uncorrelated or correlated and lead these variables rather than lag them. And what they found is that there's no evidence that the M1 leads the cycle. And they said the monetary base and M1 are generally pro-cyclical, and the money base appears to lag the cycle. So the timing they're finding is the opposite of what the conventional argument would be, because if the money supply was under government control, then how come government money supply changes after the GDP changes rather than before? And what they were doing was quite a noble aim, as they pointed out themselves, and that's simply reporting the data, which obviously is the scientific activity which economists tend to disparage. Now, you still have to have a theory choose the data. As Einstein once argued, a theory selects the data. Okay? The theory tells you what data to look at. But having said that, you can then say, well, does the data actually confirm the theory? Of course, it did in the case of Einstein, but not in the case of these guys. So they'd already developed real business cycle theory. They were saying, let's now take a look at real business cycle theory in the light of these statistics. Does the data display the patterns our theory predicts? And ironically, they're quite honest and they say the data displays patterns that are inconsistent with the theory. You would have hoped that it'd make them change the theory. Well, it didn't. But anyway, let's look at what they found. Now, they defined cycles in a very simple way. Notice the name Lucas there. And they said business cycles are simply a deviation from trend. Now, here they couldn't help but show their neoclassical colours, because they, having said how they do it, and pretty much it's like if you actually drew a pencil through the cycles, you derive the trend they're looking at. But they derided definitions that said there's some causal dynamic to the cycles in capitalism. And they referred back to the work of Mitchell, who gave us the National Bureau of Economic Research and lots of research into the empirical dynamics of capitalism. And Mitchell said that current theories, meaning back when he wrote his work on business cycles 50, 60 years ago, most current theories explain crises by what happens during prosperity and revivals by what happens in depression. Notice the use of the word depression back then rather than just recession. Now they said, well, theories with deterministic cyclical laws of motion may look like they had potential to explain the business cycle, but in fact they have failed to do so. Nice strong statement. Why have they failed? Well, they've failed because you can't generate cyclical laws of motion from theories that give you equilibrium behaviour. So they're ruling out a theoretical explanation on the basis that it clashes with their theory that everything happens in equilibrium. I'm sorry, you can't eliminate one theory on the basis that it clashes with another theory. You've got to test them both against the data. It's an insane basis on which to reject deterministic theories. And as it happens, as I'll show you, the data that they get is consistent with deterministic cycle theories. What they did anyway, getting back to the empirical work they did, which was quite good, was they took a range of economic data, things like GDP, consumption, labour income, monetary variables as well, and then they took the logs of the variables and then the change in the logs, because a simple rule of mathematics tells you that the differential of the log of a function is the percentage rate of change of that function with respect to time. So that's the rate of change of the function. That's the current value divided into it, and the ratio of the two is the current percentage rate of change. The simple rule of mathematics that economists make regular use of in their empirical fitting. Then what they did was they tried to find a vector they called tau of t to minimise the value of a peculiar looking function, and that function is first of all the value of whatever variable they're looking at, and that variable can be GDP, wages, M0, M1, whatever it might be. So y is the actual vector of values, t is the subscript for time. So if you're looking from 1950 through to 2000 and you had quarterly data, there'd be 200 elements in that particular vector. And tau of t is the estimated trend. So there's also going to be 200 elements in here, but they're going to be the predictions of what the trend value is rather than the actual value at a particular time. Now, this lambda here is just an arbitrary number, a weighting factor to combine two components of this overall function. That bit of the function emphasises the trend. That's the long-run trend in the data. This bit emphasises the cycles over time. So what you're trying to say, let's find a value for tau, the tau being the entire vector of values, that minimise the value of that function. And what you've then got is an estimated trend of the rate of growth. And that is again a bit like drawing a line through all the curvy bits you see in the data. And you then subtract that trend from the actual data and you've got the cyclical component. And then you compare the cyclical components of one variable against another using regression analysis, and you shift them backwards and forwards in time using leads and lags to see whether the correlations increase or decrease if you change the time lags. So graphically this is what they're doing. Here's a look at nominal GDP in raw data terms in America. So you get that exponential increase in the nominal value of GDP from 1960 through to 2000 or thereabouts. Then you take the logs, so you get something that's roughly a straight line, but you notice that it's not completely a straight line. That'd be smooth exponential growth. So clearly the data is actually cyclical. Then you derive a simplistic trend line. Now I'm showing a simple one here. I'm simply taking the moving average of the previous 4 quarters as the trend. Okay. Now I get a difference between the two, so I subtract one from the other, and that's the cyclical component. Having done all that, you do same thing with another variable like investment. And you notice how investment is much more volatile, much less a linear trend. There's the moving average. That's the log of the difference, and then you graph the two over each other, and that's what you've got. Now notice investment's much more volatile than output there. But having done it, you then find the ways in which it varies. And they actually argue, the range of things I won't cover in great detail here, but they're talking about how aggregate output volatility is mainly due to investment. The key one I want to focus on is argument about the role of the money supply. They argue the money base doesn't lead the cycle. In fact, M1 itself lags the cycle and M0 lags it by even more. And one of the intriguing things they conclude is that if you look at M2 minus M1, which is actually totally pure credit money, they say that leads the cycle by about 3/4. So changes in credit money precede changes in the cycle, while changes in M0 come after the cycle. And they also find that the velocity of money is quite volatile. So you've got these conclusions coming out which are very hard to tie into a theory that says the money supply is exogenous. Because for M0 to cause M2, how could M2 minus M1 be changing 1 year ahead of M0 itself? Now, they ended up, despite their neoclassical leanings, coming out with conclusions that support the work of non-neoclassical authors. And one of the main things they said here, which is extremely important, is they said that because the credit system appears to move ahead of the cycle, including money and credit into growth theory in a way that accounts for the cyclical behaviour of monetary as well as real aggregates, is an important open problem in economics. Absolutely. They did nothing about it. But they're actually saying there you need a theory in which credit plays an essential role. And also one in which V is not stable, V can vary over the trade cycle. So they've got empirical research that doesn't support the proposition that the money supply is controlled by what the government does. In fact, the reverse seems to be the case. V is not stable, in fact it's volatile. It doesn't appear that high employment and high economic activity lead to price inflation. One of the unusual results they got, and it argues that income distribution dynamics play a major part in the trade cycle, and that credit and debt are important. Now, none of those fit with neoclassical theory. All of them point towards money being endogenous, determined by the economy itself, not determined outside the economy. Pardon me. And actually interacting with real variables rather than being simply determinative inflation. And the causation is the reverse of the conventional theory. Now, that reverse causation exists in post-Keynesian economics. I'm going now from trashing neoclassical to pointing out a possibility of another way of looking at the economy. And the person who first gave us the theory of endogenous money and the empirical research to back it up was actually a Canadian post-Keynesian economist called Basil Moore. Now, Basil, way back, I think actually would have been possibly before even Hicks criticised ISLM, he criticised ILM. And he said that what actually happens is not the causal mechanism that you get for the vertical money supply argument. He said the central bank is actually driven by what happens in the private economy. It has to accommodate the demands that the commercial banking sector makes for liquidity. And a major part of his case was looking at the mechanism of which loans were extended to large corporations back in the 60s and 70s. It's no longer the mechanism because banks found it was far easier to make money by financing Ponzi schemes than it was by financing working capital for corporations. So as a result, rather than getting lines of credit, which is what Basil goes on to talk about here, rather than getting that, companies like GM and so had to get the money to pay wages by issuing what they call commercial paper, putting out their own bonds with very short time periods and getting the money that way to pay wages and salaries and suppliers. And that's why the collapse of Lehman was so crucial, because Lehman, as it happened, had cornered the market on commercial paper. So when Lehman went down, the funding to pay wages the next week disappeared from the American economy. That's why it was so crucial. But anyway, back in when Basil was writing this stuff, banks were still largely doing what banks should do, which is providing working capital for major corporations through lines of credit. And that's a bit like your bank card, your MasterCard. You know, you might have a $10,000 limit, you've used $3,000 of it. That means you have the absolute right to go out and buy a new stereo system for $7,000, if anybody spends that much money on a stereo anymore. Nobody can stop you doing it. Well, the same thing with a line of credit. If a company had negotiated $1 billion line of credit and it had $300 million that it currently used, and it wanted to go and buy a super tanker or three, then it could simply go and do it, increase the debt level to $1 billion, thereby creating $700 million of additional money instantly, and creating the additional debt for itself at the same time. So that's the mechanism by which companies gave themselves the capacity to react smoothly to changes they might need to make either in their investment plans or in their wage payments. And the main thing that Basil looked at was the role of wage settlements, in meaning that firms had to go and get an increase in the amount of money they had from the commercial, from the banking sector by dipping into these lines of credit. So rather than saying growth in money caused wage rises and therefore inflation, Basil said largely wage rises and inflation cause growth in the money supply. If you have an increase in wage costs, you've got to go and get the money out to pay them, which you can do with your line of credit. And if you have an increase in the cost of oil, which happened back in the days of OPEC, of course, when they increased oil prices by a factor of 4 on 2 separate occasions, you simply had to pay for that oil, so you did it by dipping into your line of credit. Therefore, wages and inflation cause growth in the money supply, not vice versa. And the main thing that Basil focused on here is changes in wages and employment, which determine demand for bank loans, and that in turn determines the rate of growth of the money stock. He said central banks have got no alternative but to accept that. If they try to stop that, they bring the economy to a halt. And no reserve bank has got the guts, or the, fortunately also in some ways the stupidity, to do that. But they've got other forms of pretty impressive stupidity. So the Reserve Bank can control the interest rate, but they can't control the stock of money. And that's exactly what the experience was when they tried the monetarist experiment without this sophisticated understanding of how banking actually operates back in the 70s and 80s. Now, in a nutshell, the supply of money and credit is determined by the demand for it. There's no independent supply curve. It's more complicated than that. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in future lectures. But all the state can do, it can't control the money supply. It can have some impact on the price of credit, which is what the Reserve Bank will have fun doing tomorrow. So conventional theory, according to Basel, springs from the belief that money was once gold and silver coin. Now again, there's a lot of debates about where money came from, and there's a very good new book out by a guy called David Graeber, who's an anthropologist, therefore knows more about what he's talking about than economists do. In a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years, he argues that in fact credit preceded notes and coins. So credit's been the normal form of money, and credits and coin and money notes came along later. But today we economists, including a lot of the post-Keynesian crowd, still talk in terms of there being a past where you had gold being used, a commodity, or using coins or using notes, and then later credit comes along. So there's a bit of a misnomer in this old argument by Basel, but it doesn't affect the basic logic here, because he's saying conventional economic theory behaves as if the modern system is simply a variant on using gold as a commodity for money. And he said instead endogenous money theorists look at the invention of credit when negotiable notes were first issued. And he said the crucial innovation was finding that a banking house for sufficient repute, pardon me, I'm a bit tired, could dispense with issuing the actual gold and silver coin and instead issue notes, which were paid to the bearer rather than to a named individual. And if people accepted the promise of that organisation to pay, then that became the form of transaction. So the growth of credit is what gave us the modern monetary system. Now when he says modern monetary theory, by the way, he doesn't mean a new variant of post-Keynesian economics called modern monetary theory, which I'm somewhat of a critic of. He means neoclassical theory back in the 60s and 70s. He said that theory has a theory of money which is more appropriate to when money was a commodity, without recognising the difference between a commodity and credit money. And he said if you actually had a commodity money, if you actually use gold or silver as your money, then the amount of money you've got is clearly limited by what's been accumulated so far and new output from new mines producing additional gold and silver. And what the monetarist theory does is treat modern credit money exactly the same way. It assumes there's some independent supply function of money. Now, he said that's feasible if it's commodities, and Basel Egan says it's feasible if it's fiat money because the government can decide how much to supply. But in a credit money system, the supply of credit adjusts to the demands for it. So it's a big mistake to confuse commodity money, which is a material thing and doesn't necessarily involve a claim on somebody else with it, with credit money where the money is created and simultaneously creates a claim on somebody else. So you don't have an independent supply schedule. And Basel argued fairly forcefully in what became known as horizontalism. The stock of the bank money supply is completely determined by borrowers' demands for credit. Now, that case has been attenuated in later days, but that's the proposition. So I've now got to go back and deconstruct some of what you've already been taught, which is the whole quantity theory equation to begin with. And that says, here's this equation relating the velocity of money to the price level, level of output, and the money supply. Now, it's a truism. It's definitional. That's how V is defined. But these three are givens. The price level, which you can, given the actual level of nominal output, you can break it down into the price level times real output with an index number system, which brings in problems of its own. There's your stock of money, which you can also measure. And V is just the ratio of the product of the first two to the third one. The exogenous money case that Friedman made, and his main research goal was trying to prove that V was stable, because the endogenous money case argues that's going to vary quite dramatically. And as you've seen, the stats from Kydland and Prescott support the endogenous money view, that V is highly volatile and will rise during a boom and fall during slumps. So what that means is, for a start, the equation is flexible. Okay? And also it works backwards. So if you have a government attempting to rigidly control the money supply, then V will rise because banks will find ways of lending money around that. They'll innovate, they'll produce finance companies and stuff like that. Or the circulation will increase in speed. So V will change. And then, as Basel argues, changes in the price level and the level of output force changes on the money supply. So causation works in reverse. So it's not a causal equation. It's a truism which has been interpreted the wrong way round by neoclassical theory. Then you've got the relationship between broad money and the money base That's bank loans, well, equivalent to bank loans, at least in theory. Bank loans are actually, pardon me, a lot larger than recorded money supply. There's your money multiplier, there's base money. Now again, Basil's argument is that yes, the Reserve Bank can control B, but the primary role that a central bank has to be a lender of last resort. It guarantees depositors' funds and it stops banks going bankrupt because they can't meet their obligations to other banks. If a bank does get into trouble, pardon me, then the central bank will either relax the money multiplier and allow a higher ratio of credit money to base money, pardon me, or expand base money, as we've seen Bernanke do dramatically since the crisis struck. So he said the need to have an elastic currency to offset those fluctuations in the economy and avoid chaotic interest rate fluctuations and crises, which are major reason why the Federal Reserve System was formed in the first place. So causation runs backwards here as well. Disturbances in the money supply force the hand of the government and the central bank to change either the base money level or the money multiplier or both. So Basil's arguing that the primary role that banks have or should have, they've long ago retreated from it, is to provide working capital for firms. The primary need for working capital is new wage demands or new changes in material costs, as with oil back in the 70s, and also investment. This is actually another point that it's intriguing what you can find when you look. Fama and French, you know how much I trash those guys normally, except for their honesty in 2004. Well, in doing a bit of empirical research, they also found something quite intriguing and said that it appears that debt is the residual variable in financial decisions. Investment increases debt and higher earnings tend to reduce debt. Now if I put that in my favourite differential equation terms, that's saying the rate of change of debt is investment minus profits. And I'll come back to that very deliberately in later lectures, pardon me. Again, the same sort of argument. The source of financing most correlated with investment is long-term debt. Debt plays a key role in accommodating year-by-year variations in investment. So a combination of working capital, changes in material costs and investment are what determine changes in the level of debt. And that will expand and contract with respect to the needs of firms. So if they face some new demand, they'll go to their line of credit and extend it. That increases their loans and the deposits at the same time, because the new deposits are created with the loans, and the rise in new deposits increases the balance of new indebtedness, and then the central bank has to underwrite that increase in liquidity, otherwise it'll cause a financial crisis. So causation works from P and T to M, and from big M to little m and B. And therefore the money supply is determined not by the government, but by what the commercial sector needs, and it can therefore expand or contract independent of what government policy is. Now when it does so, of course, it changes the level of debt, and therefore the dynamics of debt play an important role in determining what happens in the monetary system and the economy in general. So the behaviour of the commercial sector, the financial behaviour, is the crucial part of what happens in the economy. That's why you can't slice finance off from economics. So I think it's quite a persuasive case there, but it requires a fundamentally monetary vision of the economy when you've been taught to have a barter vision of the economy. So you've now got to go from having a fictional and false barter vision to at least a realistic, if not fully developed, monetary view of how the economy operates. You can't simply take a barter system and whack cash into it, which is what neoclassicals have been trying to do and failing forever. So credit originates from credit money originates in the credit that banks extend. And therefore it necessarily has debt involved there, and it has effects not just on the price level, but also output, employment, and so on. So this is a monetary vision which starts also from inverting how you think about why trade occurs, because part of the argument that money is just a veil over barter is to say that what trade is really about is consumption. The primary focus in capitalism is consumption. Well, when you have the monetary vision, the primary focus of business is to make a profit, accumulate wealth. Now the best argument about that it's just being a barter goes back to Jean-Baptiste Say, and that man is far more important in the economics you've been taught than I think most of you realise. He was really the fountainhead of neoclassical economics rather than Smith. So here's his catechism on political economy, and he explains what he sees as the vision of capitalism and says, every producer asked for money only for the purpose of employing that money immediately in the purchase of another product. So though producers have the air of demanding money, they really demand merchandise for their merchandise. That's the vision. Ignore money. Money doesn't matter. Now, Marx, on the other hand, and I'll be turning up a lot in what I teach you in the next few lectures, has a much better argument in the opposite direction. And he says, yeah, okay, one part of this is true. He's quite happy to concede that trade is something that both sides gain from. They swap what they don't have, what they have and don't want for what they don't have and do want. So both parties gain an advantage. Marx is quite happy to admit that. So both sides gain. But he said, that isn't the main gain of capitalism. One of these wonderfully profound statements from Marx: it must never be forgotten that in capitalist production what matters is not the immediate use value, but the exchange value, and in particular, what we would call profit, the expansion of surplus value. He said that's the driving motive of capitalist production, and it's a pretty conception, a delusion, that abstracts from its very basis and depicts capitalism as being about the direct satisfaction of the consumption of the producers. Fundamentally, that's secondary. That's got to happen, but it's secondary to making a profit, which is what really drives capitalist behaviour. So money is the ultimate name of the game, and it's the ultimate form of accumulated wealth as well. Now, Keynes also had to go with this whole idea that money was avail over barter. And he said, as you may have noticed that I had saying we don't consume money, effectively arguing money has no utility. But Keynes says there's a very definite utility to money, and that's the security it gives you in an uncertain world. And we're seeing plenty of sign of people rushing for that security right now with the collapse in the stock market. And Keynes actually sent up the conventional view, and he can write some incredibly turgid stuff, but he also writes some wonderfully witty prose at some stages. And he says money, it's well known, serves two principal purposes. It acts as a means of account, and the second is the store of wealth. But then he says, so we're told without a smile on the face. In other words, without any sense of irony. But he said, in the world of classical economic theory, meaning neoclassical, what an insane use to put it to, because money is barren. You don't get any interest on cash you have in your pocket. Whereas any other form gives you a yield, gives you a return. Why should anyone outside a lunatic asylum wish to use money as a store of wealth? And then answering his ironic question, he says, because partly unreasonable and partly on instinctive grounds, our desire to hold money as a store of wealth is a barometer of the degree of distrust of our own calculations and conventions concerning the future. Uncertain expectations. So money is essentially different to commodities. If you have a hoard of commodities during a crisis, it can be worthless. If you have a hoard of money, you can exchange it for something else. So when the crisis hits, people dive to money. And we're seeing that right now. Even though, they're saying the dollar's going to be worth less over time, now they're switching over to dollar assets and also to stuff they know the government will back. Now, this gives you, as well as inverting the role of money and the importance of money and profit versus consumption, this view also inverts the creation process for money, because I now argue that loans create deposits. This is Basil's original innovation here. And the causal sequence is like this, very different to the money multiplier case. You have a banking sector that exists to make loans. That's how it makes money, by creating debt. And there's a borrower, a firm, that wants money. Let's say it's $100 million. It goes to the bank and asks for a loan. The bank says, yep, you've got a loan. Here's $100 million. By the way, you owe us $100 million. Now, with the $100 million, the firm then spends that money over time, so it turns up in the hands of suppliers who themselves deposit that money in other bank accounts within the same banking system. We're talking a national system or a global system here. And around it goes and continues circulating indefinitely. But initially you have the creation of money and debt at the same time. There's a simultaneity to the creation of money. So you've got two models here. One you've been taught, the money multiplier model, where government money drives credit money, but instead what I'm going to be arguing is that credit money is independent of the fiat money system. And credit money is created by a banking sector, fiat money is created by the government. They're both stored in private bank accounts, they both get mixed, and the government might try to control the ratio between them, but the primary role the Fed's got is to ensure the system is solvent. And therefore, because it's got that requirement for liquidity, credit money is going to drive fiat money. And I'll talk about how that happens in the next lecture. Thank you.